The harsh clang of a gavel split the air like summer lightning, and Henrietta Hayes felt her world crumble beneath her feet. The crowded courtroom in Llano, Texas fell silent, every eye fixed on her pale face as Judge Wilson's voice boomed through the stuffy chamber. The court finds the defendant, Miss Henrietta Hayes, mentally unsound and a danger to herself and others. She is hereby ordered committed to the Southwestern Asylum for the Insane until such time as her condition improves. Henrietta's knees buckled. The spring of 1877 had already stolen everything from her: her father, her home, her dignity. Now it would take her freedom too. As the bailiff approached with manacles, she searched the sea of unsympathetic faces, finding not one ally among them. The townspeople of Llano had already condemned her long before today's hearing. After all, what sane woman would claim that her father's business partner had murdered him for the silver mine they shared in the far corner of the courtroom? A tall figure shifted in the shadows. Forrest Hayes, no relation to Henrietta, despite sharing her surname, watched the proceedings with a deepening frown. He had only returned to Llano 3 days ago after years driving cattle up to Kansas, and this mockery of justice was his unwelcome homecoming. He didn't know Henrietta personally, but something about the determined set of her jaw and the flash of intelligence in her eyes made him doubt the judge's ruling. And Forrest Hayes had always trusted his instincts. As they led Henrietta away, her voice rose above the murmurs of the crowd. "I am not mad. Bernard Thornton murdered my father. The evidence is in the mine. Someone just needs to look." Her desperate eyes swept the room one last time before the bailiff pulled her through the door. Forrest slipped out of the courthouse and into the harsh Texas sun, his mind already turning over possibilities. He'd been gone from Llano for 7 years, but some things never changed in a small town, including corruption. If there was truth to the woman's claims, someone needed to find it. And quickly. The next morning found Forrest at the jail where they were holding Henrietta until transport to the asylum arrived. Sheriff Jenkins eyed him suspiciously. "What business you got with the Hayes girl, Forrest? Ain't seen you in these parts for years, and suddenly you're interested in our town lunatic." Forrest leaned against the wall, keeping his voice casual. "Just curious is all. My pa always spoke highly of Edward Hayes. Seems strange his daughter would suddenly go mad." Jenkins snorted. "Nothing sudden about it. Been making wild accusations since her pa died 2 months back. Thornton's been patient, but even he has his limits. She threatened him with a pistol last week right in the middle of the general store." "That true?" Forrest asked. "Got a dozen witnesses," Jenkins replied. "Now, if you're done asking questions, I got work to do." Forrest nodded and left, but instead of heading to the saloon as Jenkins clearly expected, he made his way toward the Hayes property on the edge of town. The modest house stood empty now, its windows like vacant eyes staring across the scrubby Texas landscape. Behind it, the entrance to the small silver mine that had brought Edward Hayes modest prosperity was sealed with fresh lumber. As Forrest examined the boarded mine entrance, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made him turn. Bernard Thornton rode toward him, flanked by 2 rough-looking men Forrest didn't recognize. "This is private property now," Thornton called, pulling his horse to a stop. "Hayes Mining Company belongs to me since Edward's unfortunate passing." Forrest touched the brim of his hat. "Mr. Thornton, just paying my respects. My father and Edward Hayes were friends." Thornton's eyes narrowed. "Hayes, is it? Any relation to the girl?" "None," Forrest replied evenly. "Just a coincidence." "Well, coincidence or not, I'd appreciate you moving along. We're doing some dangerous work here today." Forrest nodded and mounted his horse, but as he rode away, he glanced back to see Thornton and his men dismounting at the mine entrance. Their furtive movements and the rifles they carried told him they weren't there for mining work. That evening, Forrest paid a young boy to deliver a message to the jail. After dark, he waited in the alley beside the sheriff's office until a deputy led Henrietta out the back door for some fresh air. When the deputy stepped away to light a cigarette, Forrest made his move. "Miss Hayes," he whispered from the shadows, "don't look alarmed, I want to help you." Henrietta's head jerked toward his voice, her eyes wide with suspicion. "Who are you?" "Name's Forrest Hayes. I was in the courtroom yesterday. I believe you about your father." The change in her expression was immediate. Hope bloomed across her features, making her look younger than her 23 years. "Why would you believe me when no one else does?" "Because Thornton and his men were at the mine today, armed like they were expecting trouble. That's not how innocent men behave." Henrietta glanced nervously at the deputy, who remained preoccupied with his smoke. "The ledger," she whispered urgently. "Father kept a secret ledger showing the true value of the silver deposits. Thornton wanted to buy him out cheaply, but Father refused when he discovered how much silver was really there. I know Thornton killed him, but the sheriff won't even investigate." "Where's the ledger now?" "Hidden at our house beneath a floorboard in my father's study, but you'll never get in there. Thornton's men watch the place." Forrest's eyes held her steadily. "The asylum wagon comes tomorrow, doesn't it?" She nodded, fear flickering across her face. "I'll find the ledger," he promised. "And I'll stop them from taking you." Before she could respond, the deputy turned back, and Forrest melted into the darkness. He had less than 24 hours to save a woman he barely knew from a fate that, in many ways, was worse than death. The next morning, Forrest rode to the Hayes house before dawn. As expected, one of Thornton's men dozed on the porch, a rifle across his lap. Moving silently through the early morning shadows, Forrest crept to the back of the house. A window with a broken latch gave him access to the kitchen. Inside, the house was unnervingly still, personal belongings scattered as if the occupant had been taken suddenly. Forrest found the study easily enough, a small room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a sturdy desk. He examined the floorboards carefully, testing each one until he found a loose board beneath the desk. Prying it up revealed a small metal box containing a leather-bound ledger and several folded documents. The ledger told a damning story. Edward Hayes had discovered a rich vein of silver, potentially worth tens of thousands of dollars, but had kept the information secret from his partner. According to entries in Edward's precise handwriting, he suspected Thornton of stealing from their previous profits and planned to dissolve their partnership. The final entry, dated the day before his death, mentioned a meeting with Thornton. More surprising were the document's official assay reports confirming the value of the silver, and a hand-drawn map showing precisely where the rich vein was located. If Thornton had killed Hayes before learning this information, he might still be searching for the vein's exact location. Forrest was about to leave when footsteps sounded on the porch. He slipped the ledger and map into his jacket and pressed himself against the wall beside the study door. Through the crack, he saw Thornton himself enter the house, followed by the sheriff. "I'm telling you, Jenkins, someone was here," Thornton was saying. "My man swears he heard noises." "Probably just the wind," Jenkins replied. "This place has been empty for weeks. Check it anyway. I can't afford any more trouble before we move the girl to the asylum. I've already paid enough to keep this quiet." Forrest's jaw tightened at the confirmation of corruption. As the two men moved toward the study, he slipped silently into a small closet. Through the thin door, he heard them enter the room he'd just vacated. "Damnation!" Thornton suddenly exclaimed. The floorboard's been moved. Someone found it. Found what? Jenkins asked, his voice sharp with sudden interest. Never mind what. We need to move up our timeline. Get the girl ready for transport immediately. I want her gone by noon. The asylum wagon isn't due until this evening. Then find another way. Pay someone to take her. I don't care how, but get her out of Lano today. Forrest waited until they stormed out of the house before emerging from his hiding place. He had even less time than he'd thought. Slipping out the back window, he circled wide around the property to avoid being seen and rode hard back to town. By mid-morning, Forrest had formulated a plan. It was risky and depended on several factors he couldn't control, but it was Henrietta's only chance. He sent telegrams to the federal marshal in Austin and to a lawyer friend in San Antonio who owed him a favor. Then he visited the bank and made a substantial withdrawal from his cattle drive earnings. His final stop was the newspaper office, where editor Samuel Potter was already half drunk despite the early hour. "Potter," Forrest greeted him, placing a small stack of coins on the man's desk. "I need information about Judge Wilson." Potter eyed the money, then swept it into his drawer. "What kind of information?" "The kind that would explain why he's so eager to lock up Henrietta Hayes without a proper investigation into her claims." Potter's bloodshot eyes darted toward the door before he leaned forward. "Wilson owes Thornton money, a lot of it. Gambling debts from their monthly poker games at the Cattleman's Club. And there's talk that Thornton's got something on the judge, something that would ruin him if it got out." "What about the sheriff?" Potter shrugged. "Jenkins goes wherever the wind blows. Always has. If Thornton's the strongest force in town, that's where Jenkins's loyalty lies." Forrest nodded thoughtfully. "One more thing. Is Judge Wilson in his chambers today?" "Until noon. Then he's heading out to his ranch for the weekend." Potter squinted at Forrest. "What are you planning, Hayes?" "Nothing illegal," Forrest assured him, which wasn't entirely a lie. "Just looking for justice." As Forrest left the newspaper office, he spotted unusual activity at the jail. A wagon was being prepared, not the official asylum transport, but a simple farm wagon with a cage hastily constructed in its bed. They were moving Henrietta early, just as Thornton had ordered. Forrest quickened his pace toward the courthouse. His plan needed to be adjusted, and he had precious little time to do it. Judge Wilson was finishing his midday meal when Forrest entered his chambers without knocking. The judge looked up, irritation flashing across his florid face. "Who the devil are you? How dare you barge in here?" Forrest closed the door behind him and tossed the Hayes ledger onto the judge's desk. "My name is Forrest Hayes, and I'm here about a miscarriage of justice involving Henrietta Hayes." The judge's face flushed darker. "That matter is closed. The woman is deranged and has been committed for her own safety. She's being transported right now ahead of schedule," Forrest said calmly. "On whose authority was that change made?" Wilson shifted uncomfortably. "The sheriff made arrangements. It's all perfectly legal." "Is it legal to commit a woman to an asylum because she knows too much about a murder? Is it legal to rush her out of town before anyone can verify her claims?" Forrest tapped the ledger. "This proves Bernard Thornton had motive to kill Edward Hayes. The silver discovery was worth a fortune, and Hayes was planning to dissolve their partnership." "This proves nothing except that you broke into private property," Wilson blustered, but his eyes betrayed his unease. "I've sent copies of the relevant pages to the federal marshal in Austin," Forrest continued, "along with details about your gambling debts to Thornton. I wonder how the territorial governor would view a judge being in the pocket of a man he's helping to protect from murder charges." Wilson's face paled. "You're making wild accusations without evidence, just like that Hayes woman," Forrest leaned forward, his voice dropping dangerously. "We both know I'm not. Now, here's what's going to happen. You're going to come with me to the jail, and you're going to rescind your commitment order. You're going to declare publicly that new evidence calls for a full investigation into Edward Hayes's death." "Or what?" Wilson challenged, though his voice lacked conviction. "Or by this time tomorrow, every newspaper from here to Austin will be running the story of how Judge Wilson helped cover up a murder to satisfy his own debts. Your career will be over, possibly your freedom as well." For a long moment, the judge stared at him, weighing his options. Then, with trembling hands, he reached for his coat. "This is coercion. This is justice," Forrest corrected. "And it's more mercy than you've shown Henrietta Hayes." They reached the jail just as two deputies were escorting Henrietta toward the waiting wagon. Her wrists were shackled, her face tear-streaked but defiant. When she saw Forrest walking beside the judge, her steps faltered. "Stop that wagon," Judge Wilson called out, his judicial authority reasserting itself despite the circumstances. "Bring Miss Hayes back inside immediately." Sheriff Jenkins emerged from the jail, confusion evident on his weathered face. "Judge, what's going on here?" "New evidence has come to light," Wilson announced stiffly. "The commitment order for Miss Hayes is temporarily suspended pending further investigation." A small crowd began to gather, drawn by the unusual spectacle. Among them, Forrest spotted Bernard Thornton pushing his way forward, his face contorted with rage. "This is absurd," Thornton shouted. "The woman is dangerous and delusional. You ruled on this yourself, Wilson." "Nevertheless, Mr. Thornton, I am revisiting my decision based on new information." The judge's voice strengthened as he addressed the growing crowd. "Sheriff Jenkins, you will release Miss Hayes into the custody of—" He glanced questioningly at Forrest. "Mr. Forrest Hayes," Forrest supplied. "No relation to the accused." "Into Mr. Hayes's custody until a new hearing can be arranged," Wilson continued. "And you will immediately open an investigation into the death of Edward Hayes." Thornton's face had gone from red to white. "You can't do this. She has no proof of her wild accusations." "Actually," Forrest interjected, holding up the ledger, "she does. Edward Hayes documented everything, including his suspicions about you, Thornton. And I found this hidden exactly where Miss Hayes said it would be something only she would know if her father had confided in her before his death." A murmur ran through the crowd. Jenkins looked uncertainly between Thornton and the judge, clearly trying to determine which way the wind was now blowing. "Remove Miss Hayes's shackles," the judge ordered when no one moved. Reluctantly, a deputy stepped forward and unlocked the manacles. Henrietta rubbed her wrists, her eyes never leaving Forrest's face. For the first time since he'd seen her in the courtroom, she smiled, a small, tentative curve of her lips that transformed her entire countenance. Judge Wilson cleared his throat. "A formal hearing will be scheduled for 1 week from today. Until then, Miss Hayes is free to go, though she must remain in Leno." "This isn't over," Thornton growled, pushing through the crowd toward his horse. "Not by a long shot." As he galloped away, Forrest turned to Henrietta. "Are you all right, Miss Hayes?" She nodded, still looking somewhat dazed by the sudden turn of events. "How did you do this? Why would you do this for a stranger?" "You're not the only one who believes in justice, Miss Hayes," Forrest replied. "And I'm beginning to think you're the only sane person in this town." The crowd began to disperse, their curious eyes lingering on the unexpected pair. Judge Wilson, his duty discharged, hurried away toward his waiting carriage. "Where will you go now?" Forrest asked Henrietta. "Your house is still legally mine," she finished firmly, "though I doubt I'd feel safe there tonight." "I've taken a room at the hotel," Forrest offered. I can arrange for a separate room for you until this is resolved. Gratitude washed over her face. Thank you, Mr. Hayes, for everything. As they walked away from the jail, Henrietta suddenly stopped. Thornton won't give up easily. He killed my father. He'll try to silence me again. Forrest nodded solemnly. I know. That's why we need to find solid proof of his guilt before the hearing, and I think I know where to start looking. That night, Forrest and Henrietta sat in the hotel's small dining room, heads bent over the documents from Edward Hayes's hidden cache. Henrietta had changed into a simple blue dress borrowed from the hotel owner's wife, and with her dark hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders, she looked nothing like the desperate woman from the courtroom. Father discovered the new silver vein about 3 months ago, she explained, tracing a line on the map. He told me about it, but not Thornton. He suspected Thornton had been skimming profits for years. According to the ledger, your father was planning to dissolve the partnership, Forrest noted. When exactly did he die? Henrietta's eyes clouded with grief. April 12th. They said it was an accident that he fell down a shaft in the mine, but father knew that mine like the back of his hand. He would never have fallen unless someone pushed him, Forrest finished grimly. Were there any witnesses? Only Thornton. He claimed they were inspecting a new tunnel when father slipped in the darkness. Her voice hardened. I knew it was a lie. Father never went into the mine without proper lighting, and he certainly wouldn't have been exploring a new tunnel with only Thornton for company. Not when he suspected him of theft. Forrest studied the map. This new vein, it's in a different section than where they found your father's body. Henrietta nodded. On the opposite side of the main shaft, father marked it here. She pointed to a cross on the map, but told Thornton they should focus their digging here. Her finger moved to a different location. That's where they've been working for weeks, finding nothing of value. So Thornton still doesn't know where the rich vein is located, Forrest mused. That's why he was so desperate to find this ledger and map. And why he wanted me locked away, Henrietta added bitterly. He thought I might know. Forrest looked up, meeting her eyes. Do you think there might be evidence in the mine? Something that could prove your father's death wasn't accidental? Possibly. Father always carried a small notebook in his pocket. He recorded everything, measurements, observations. If he had it with him that day, and if it mentioned anything about his suspicions of Thornton. Then we need to search the mine, Forrest decided. Tonight. Henrietta's eyes widened. That's too dangerous. Thornton has men guarding the property, which is exactly why we need to go. If he's hiding evidence, he might try to destroy it now that you're free. Forrest reached across the table, hesitating briefly before covering her hand with his own. I won't let him get away with murdering your father, Miss Hayes, but I need your help. Their eyes held for a long moment before Henrietta nodded. I'll show you the way through the mine. There's a secondary entrance my father built that few people know about. Under the cover of darkness, they rode to the Hayes property. As expected, 2 men stood guard at the main house, but Henrietta led Forrest around to the back of the property, where a small creek cut through the rocky terrain. Following its winding path, they came to a narrow crevice in the hillside, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. Father created this entrance as a safety precaution, Henrietta explained as she squeezed through the opening. It connects to the main shaft about 50 yards in. Forrest followed, lighting a small lantern once they were inside the narrow tunnel. The air was cool and damp, heavy with the smell of earth and minerals. Henrietta moved with surprising confidence through the darkness, one hand trailing along the rough wall for guidance. You know these tunnels well, Forrest observed. Father brought me with him sometimes. He wanted me to understand the business. Pride colored her voice. He said most men underestimate what a woman can learn and do. He wasn't one of them. They reached the main shaft, a broader tunnel reinforced with wooden beams. Henrietta pointed to a ladder leading down into darkness. "Father's body was found at the bottom of that shaft," she whispered. Thornton claimed he fell while they were examining the lower level. Forrest held the lantern higher, illuminating the descent. "How deep is it?" "About 30 feet. There's a small chamber at the bottom where they store equipment." Carefully, they descended the ladder. The chamber at the bottom was cluttered with mining tools, empty crates and coils of rope. Forrest examined the earthen floor, but months of activity had erased any evidence that might have existed. "Where exactly was your father found?" he asked. Henrietta pointed to a spot near the far wall. "There. Thornton said he hit his head on that rock outcropping when he fell." Forrest crouched, running his fingers along the rough stone. "If it was an accident, your father would have had his notebook with him. Did anyone return his personal effects to you afterward?" "Only his pocket watch and wedding ring," Henrietta replied. "Sheriff Jenkins said they found nothing else on him." "Then either he wasn't carrying the notebook that day, or someone took it," Henrietta finished, her voice hardening. "Thornton." Forrest stood, lifting the lantern to examine the chamber more thoroughly. "If Thornton killed your father and took the notebook, he might have hidden it somewhere in the mine rather than risk being seen with it." They searched methodically, checking behind equipment, in empty crates, even digging into the loose earth in several places. After nearly an hour, Forrest's hand struck something solid buried beneath a pile of discarded ore samples in the corner. Brushing away the dirt, he uncovered a small leather-bound notebook, its pages stained with what appeared to be dried blood. "Is this it?" he asked, holding it up to the light. Henrietta's breath caught. "Yes, that's Father's writing." They huddled together, turning the pages carefully. The final entry was dated April 12th, the day Edward Hayes died. The writing was hurried, the ink blotched in places, "Meeting T at the mine today. Confronting him about the missing funds. Have evidence of his theft. If anything happens to me, all documentation is hidden where only H knows to look. New vein location must be protected at all costs." Henrietta's hands trembled as she touched the page. "This proves Father suspected Thornton would harm him. He was meeting him to confront him, not to explore a new tunnel." "It's circumstantial," Forrest said cautiously, "but combined with the ledger and the fact that Thornton tried to have you committed, it builds a compelling case." A sudden noise from above made them both freeze. Voices echoed down the shaft, along with the scrape of boots on the ladder. "They've found us," Henrietta whispered, fear evident in her eyes. Forrest quickly extinguished the lantern, plunging them into darkness. "The secondary entrance, can we reach it without going back up the main shaft?" "Yes. There's a connecting tunnel on this level. Follow me." Taking her hand, Forrest let Henrietta guide him through the inky blackness. Behind them, lantern light began to illuminate the chamber they had just left. Muffled cursing told them Thornton's men had discovered the disturbed area where they'd found the notebook. "They're coming for us," Henrietta breathed as they reached the narrow connecting tunnel. "Thornton must have realized what we were looking for." They hurried through the tunnel, feeling their way along the rough walls. The voices grew louder behind them, echoing confusingly in the enclosed space. Just as they reached the secondary exit, a shout announced their discovery. "There they are, in the side tunnel." A gunshot cracked through the darkness, the bullet splintering rock inches from Forrest's head. He pushed Henrietta toward the exit. "Go, I'll hold them off." Drawing his revolver, Forrest fired twice into the darkness, not aiming to hit anyone but to slow their pursuit. As Henrietta squeezed through the narrow opening, Forrest fired one more shot before following her into the night air. They ran to their horses, mounted swiftly, and galloped away just as Thornton's men emerged from the mine entrance, firing wildly after them. "Head for town," Forrest shouted over the pounding hoofbeats. "We need witnesses around us." They rode hard, not slowing until the lights of Lano appeared ahead. As they thundered down the main street, Forrest aimed for the sheriff's office, where a lamp still burned despite the late hour. Reining in sharply, they dismounted as Sheriff Jenkins stepped onto the porch, hand resting on his holstered gun. "What in tarnation is going on?" Jenkins demanded. "It's past midnight." Forrest held out the blood-stained notebook. "Evidence, Sheriff. Edward Hayes was murdered and we can prove it." Jenkins eyed them suspiciously, but the commotion had drawn attention. Several townsfolk, including the newspaper editor Potter, emerged from the nearby saloon to witness the confrontation. "This is Edward Hayes's personal notebook," Forrest continued loudly, ensuring the growing crowd could hear. "Written the day he died, it shows he was meeting Thornton to confront him about theft, not to explore the mine. And Thornton's men just tried to kill us to prevent us from finding it." Jenkins reluctantly accepted the notebook, flipping through its pages with a deepening frown. "This doesn't prove murder." "Perhaps not by itself," Henrietta interjected firmly. "But combined with my father's ledger showing the true value of the silver vein, Thornton's attempts to have me committed, and the fact that he just ordered his men to shoot at us, it certainly warrants an investigation." As if summoned by her words, the thunder of approaching horses announced Thornton's arrival. He pulled up sharply at the sight of the crowd, his men close behind him. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his eyes narrowing at the sight of Henrietta and Forrest standing defiantly before the sheriff. "Justice," Forrest replied simply, loudly enough for all to hear. "We found Edward Hayes's notebook, Thornton, the one you thought you'd buried deep enough that no one would ever find it." Thornton's face contorted with rage. "You were trespassing on my property." "Sheriff, I want these two arrested immediately." "It's my property," Henrietta corrected coldly. "At least until the partnership dispute is properly settled in court, a dispute my father initiated because he discovered you were stealing from him." Jenkins looked uncomfortable, caught between Thornton's obvious influence and the watching townspeople. Potter stepped forward, his reporter's instinct for a story overriding his usual caution. "Sheriff, as a representative of the press, I'd be interested to know why Mr. Thornton's men were shooting at these folks if they have nothing to hide." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Thornton's gaze darted around, calculating his dwindling options. "This is absurd," he blustered. "The woman is clearly deranged, just as the court determined, and this cowboy is helping her for God knows what reason. Hayes fell. It was an accident witnessed by no one but me." "That's not quite true," came a new voice from the edge of the crowd. A thin man with stooped shoulders stepped forward. "I was there that day, though neither of you saw me." Henrietta gasped. "Mr. Collins," the old man nodded. "I was working in the lower tunnel, heard every word between your pa and Thornton, the argument, the threats, the struggle." His rheumy eyes fixed on Thornton. "And I saw you push him, sir. Saw it plain as day, though I was too cowardly to speak up at the time. Figured you'd kill me too if I did." Thornton's hand moved toward his gun, but Sheriff Jenkins was quicker. "That's enough," the sheriff said, his allegiance finally shifting with the wind. "Bernard Thornton, I'm placing you under arrest on suspicion of the murder of Edward Hayes." As Jenkins moved to handcuff him, Thornton made one desperate play. He lunged for Henrietta, grabbing her and pressing a knife to her throat. "Back off, all of you," he snarled, "or I'll finish what I started with the Hayes family." Forrest's revolver was in his hand before anyone could blink, aimed steadily at Thornton's head. "Let her go, Thornton. It's over." For one tense moment, no one moved. Then Henrietta's elbow drove back hard into Thornton's stomach. As he doubled over, she twisted away, and Forrest surged forward, tackling Thornton to the ground. The knife clattered away as Forrest pinned him, pressing the revolver against his temple. "If you so much as breathe wrong, I'll send you to meet your maker right here," Forrest growled, his voice low and dangerous. Jenkins and his deputy quickly secured Thornton, leading him away to a chorus of angry shouts from the gathered townspeople. Forrest helped Henrietta to her feet, his hands gentle as he checked her for injuries. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, still trembling slightly. "No, just overwhelmed." Her eyes met his, filled with gratitude and something deeper. "You saved my life. Again." The crowd pressed around them, full of questions and sudden support now that Thornton's guilt seemed clear. Forrest kept a protective arm around Henrietta as they made their way through the throng, accepting the belated good wishes of townspeople who had been quick to judge her insane just days before. By dawn, the story had spread throughout Lano. Bernard Thornton was securely locked in the jail, charged with the murder of Edward Hayes and the attempted murder of his daughter. Judge Wilson, sensing the changing tide, issued a formal retraction of his commitment order and scheduled a hearing to resolve the matter of the Hayes-Thornton mining partnership. Forrest escorted Henrietta back to the hotel as the sky lightened with the first rays of sun. Both were exhausted but too wired to sleep. They sat in the small hotel parlor, cups of steaming coffee between them. "It doesn't feel real," Henrietta said softly. "After months of being called crazy, of fighting to be believed, it's over. Father will have justice." "Your persistence made it possible," Forrest replied. "You never gave up, even when the entire town turned against you." She smiled wanly. "I nearly did. If you hadn't intervened, I'd be on my way to that asylum by now." Her eyes searched his face. "Why did you help me, Mr. Hayes? Truly?" Forrest considered her question carefully. "At first, because something about the hearing didn't sit right with me, but then—" He paused, suddenly finding it difficult to express the connection he'd felt to her from the start. "I suppose I recognized something in you, courage, determination. The kind of person who stands up for truth, even when it's easier to look away." "Like you did," she observed softly. He shook his head. "I've spent 7 years driving cattle and avoiding putting down roots anywhere. This is the first time in a long while I've felt invested in something that matters." Henrietta reached across the table and took his hand. "Then I'm glad it was my cause that brought you back to Lano, Mr. Hayes." "Forrest," he corrected gently. "After everything we've been through, I think we can dispense with formalities." "Forrest," she agreed, her smile warming. "And I'm Henrietta." Over the next week, Lano buzzed with the scandal. More evidence emerged as people came forward with stories of Thornton's dubious business practices and violent temper. The federal marshal arrived from Austin to oversee the case, bringing with him the assurance that justice would be served regardless of local influences. Forrest and Henrietta worked together to restore order to the Hayes Mining Company. With Thornton's manipulation exposed, the true value of the silver mine became clear, as did Henrietta's rightful claim to her father's share of the business. Several of the miners who had worked for Edward Hayes returned, grateful for the opportunity and full of stories about what a fair employer he had been. Father would have wanted the mine to continue operating, Henrietta told Forrest as they walked the property one afternoon. He believed in providing good jobs and dealing honestly with people. He raised a daughter with the same principles, Forrest observed. "You could run this place yourself, you know. You understand the business as well as any man would." Henrietta looked surprised, then thoughtful. "I hadn't considered that. Everyone assumed I'd sell my share or find a male business partner. Everyone underestimated you before, Forrest reminded her. Don't let them do it again. She studied him curiously. And what about you, Forrest Hayes? What will you do once this is all settled? Back to the cattle drives, the question gave him pause. In the short time he'd known Henrietta, something fundamental had shifted inside him. The restlessness that had driven him from town to town for years had quieted in her presence. I'm not sure, he admitted. For the first time in a long while, I'm considering staying put. Her eyes brightened, though she tried to keep her tone casual. Lano could use a man like you, someone who stands up for what's right, regardless of the consequences. Before Forrest could respond, a rider approached Judge Wilson's clerk, bringing news that the hearing was scheduled for the following morning. As the young man rode away, Forrest and Henrietta exchanged glances. Tomorrow, then, she said, a mixture of anticipation and nervousness in her voice. Tomorrow, Forrest agreed. Whatever happens, Henrietta, you've already won. The truth is known and your father's killer will face justice. She nodded, but a shadow crossed her face. And afterward, when the excitement dies down and life returns to normal, will the town truly accept a woman who runs a mining company on her own? Some will, some won't, Forrest answered honestly. But you've proven your strength. Anyone who doubts you does so at their peril. His words brought a smile back to her face, and together they continued their inspection of the mine that would soon be fully hers. The courthouse was packed the next morning. Every resident of Lano, it seemed, wanted to witness the final act in the drama that had consumed their town. Judge Wilson, now scrupulously proper in his dealings, called the session to order precisely at 9 o'clock. This court has convened to address two matters, he announced. First, the formal dismissal of all questions regarding the mental competence of Miss Henrietta Hayes. Second, the legal disposition of the Hayes Thornton Mining Company in light of recent events. What followed was a stark contrast to the mockery of justice that had occurred in the same room just days earlier. Witness after witness testified to Henrietta's sound mind and character. Sheriff Jenkins, now firmly aligned with the prevailing winds, presented the evidence of Thornton's crimes. Old Mr. Collins recounted in detail what he had seen and heard the day Edward Hayes died. Throughout it all, Henrietta sat with dignified composure, Forrest a steady presence beside her. When the judge finally called her to speak, she rose with quiet confidence. Your Honor, my father built his business on honesty and fair dealing. When he discovered Mr. Thornton's theft, he confronted him directly rather than going behind his back. It cost him his life. Her clear voice carried throughout the hushed courtroom. I ask only that his legacy be protected. The mining company that bears his name should continue as he would have wanted it to, providing good jobs and contributing to the prosperity of Lano. Judge Wilson nodded gravely. And how do you propose this should be accomplished, Miss Hayes? Do you intend to sell your interest in the company? Henrietta straightened her shoulders. No, Your Honor, I intend to run it myself. My father taught me everything about the business, and I have every confidence in my ability to manage it successfully. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Wilson raised an eyebrow but did not comment on her unusual ambition. Very well, he declared after a moment. This court finds that all previous rulings regarding the mental competence of Miss Henrietta Hayes were made in error and are hereby vacated. Furthermore, in light of Bernard Thornton's crimes against both Edward Hayes and his daughter, all of his interest in the Hayes Thornton Mining Company is forfeit and reverts to the Hayes estate. Miss Hayes, as sole heir, is recognized as the rightful owner of the entire operation. He banged his gavel, making the ruling official. This matter is concluded." As the crowd began to disperse, many approached Henrietta to offer belated congratulations and support. She accepted their good wishes graciously, though Forrest noted the skeptical glances some still cast her way. A woman running a mining company remained a radical notion, even in the wake of such dramatic events. They made their way through the crowd and out onto the courthouse steps. The bright May sunshine felt symbolic, somehow a new day, a fresh start after months of darkness. "How does it feel to be officially sane?" Forrest asked with a smile as they descended the steps. Henrietta laughed, a genuine, joyful sound he hadn't heard from her before. "Remarkably similar to being unofficially sane, but with fewer people trying to lock me away." They reached the bottom of the steps, and Forrest suddenly realized that their journey together had reached its natural conclusion. Henrietta was safe, her father's killer awaiting trial, her business and reputation restored. There was no further need for his protection or assistance. The thought struck him with unexpected force, leaving an emptiness he hadn't anticipated. In just over a week, Henrietta Hayes had become central to his world in a way no one had been for years. "Forrest, is something wrong?" Henrietta asked, noticing his sudden silence. He turned to face her fully, aware that they were still in full view of half the town on the courthouse steps. It hardly seemed to matter. "I was just thinking about next steps," he said carefully. "You have your mind to run, a life to rebuild." "Yes," she agreed, watching him with those perceptive eyes that seemed to see straight through him. "And you? Have you decided whether you're staying in Lano?" The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility. Forrest had never been a man to hesitate once his mind was made up, and suddenly, with perfect clarity, he knew exactly what he wanted. "That depends," he said, taking her hands in his. Henrietta's eyes widened slightly. "On what?" "On whether there might be a place for me here. Not just in Lano, but in your life." The words came more easily than he'd expected. "Henrietta, I know we've known each other only a short time, but in that time, I've come to admire you more than any woman I've ever met. Your courage, your intelligence, your determination." "Forrest," she whispered, her cheeks flushing. He pressed on, aware of the gathering audience but focused only on her. "I'm not a mining expert, but I'm a quick learner. I've managed cattle operations, handled men and payrolls. I could help with the business if you'd want that, or I could just be there, to support you, to stand beside you when others doubt." Understanding dawned in her eyes, along with something that looked remarkably like hope. "Are you proposing a business partnership, Mr. Hayes?" she asked, a hint of teasing in her voice despite the seriousness of the moment. "No, Miss Hayes," he replied, dropping to one knee right there on the courthouse steps. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers, but Forrest heard only the quickening of Henrietta's breath. "I'm proposing marriage, a true partnership in every sense of the word." Henrietta's free hand flew to her mouth, her eyes bright with sudden tears. For one terrible moment, Forrest feared he had misread everything, moved too quickly, assumed too much. Then she smiled, a radiant, transformative smile that lit her entire face. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, Forrest Hayes. I will marry you." He rose to his feet and, propriety be damned, pulled her into his arms. The courthouse steps erupted in cheers and applause as he kissed her, sealing their unexpected bond in front of the very town that had once condemned her. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless and beaming, Editor Potter pushed his way forward, pencil and notepad already in hand. "Miss Hayes, Mr. Hayes, what a story this will make." The judge ordered her committed, a cowboy proved her sanity and proposed on the courthouse steps. "That's the headline I'll run tomorrow. Care to comment?" Forrest laughed, keeping one arm firmly around Henrietta's waist. "Print whatever you like, Potter. For once, the Leno Chronicle will be telling the absolute truth. Henrietta leaned into Forrest's embrace, her eyes shining with a happiness that had seemed impossible just days ago. "Make sure you mention that I accepted," she told Potter with a smile. "That's the most important part of the story." As the crowd surged around them with well wishes, Forrest bent to whisper in Henrietta's ear. "Are you sure about this? It's not too fast." She turned to him, her expression serene and certain. "Some people search their whole lives for someone who truly sees them. You saw me at my lowest moment and believed in me when no one else would. I don't need more time to know that's the man I want beside me for the rest of my life." They married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Lano. The town turned out in force, eager to witness the culmination of the story that had captivated them all. Judge Wilson, seeking to rehabilitate his damaged reputation, offered to perform the ceremony, but Henrietta politely declined in favor of the local minister. As spring turned to summer, the Hayes silver mine flourished under its new management. Forrest brought his experience with men and operations, while Henrietta contributed her detailed knowledge of the mine itself and her father's business practices. Together, they formed a formidable team that quickly earned the respect of even the most skeptical townspeople. Bernard Thornton was transferred to Austin to await trial, his influence in Lano completely destroyed. In his absence, the town seemed to breathe more freely, as if a shadow had been lifted. Sheriff Jenkins, ever the political survivor, became an enthusiastic supporter of the Hayes family business, particularly after Forrest and Henrietta funded improvements to the town jail. By autumn, Henrietta and Forrest had settled into a comfortable rhythm both at home and at work. They converted Edward Hayes's modest house into a warm and welcoming home, honoring his memory while building their future together. In the evenings, they would often sit on the porch, watching the Texas sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. "You ever regret it?" Henrietta asked one such evening as they sat side by side, her head resting on his shoulder. "Giving up the freedom of your cattle-driving days to settle down with a woman who was nearly committed to an asylum," Forrest chuckled, pulling her closer. "I've never been more certain of any decision in my life. The open road was never really freedom, it was just running from putting down roots." He kissed the top of her head. "Besides, life with you is more exciting than any cattle drive." Henrietta smiled, her hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach. They had only confirmed the pregnancy the week before, and the news was still a delicious secret between them. "It's about to get even more exciting," she murmured. "Do you think we're ready to be parents, after everything we've faced together?" "A baby will be the easy part," Forrest assured her, though his voice held a note of wonder that betrayed his own amazement at the path his life had taken. As night fell over Lano, bringing with it a canopy of stars so clear and bright they seemed close enough to touch, Henrietta reflected on the extraordinary turn of events that had brought her here. From the depths of despair, facing a life imprisoned for insanity, to this moment of perfect contentment, all because one man had looked at her and seen the truth when others saw only what was convenient to believe. "I love you, Forrest Hayes," she said softly into the darkness. His arms tightened around her. "And I love you, Henrietta Hayes, sanest woman in all of Texas." Their laughter mingled in the night air, the sound of happiness hard-won and deeply cherished. Spring of 1878 brought new life to the Hayes household with the birth of their son, Edward Forrest Hayes, named for his grandfather and father. The entire town celebrated the arrival, and even Judge Wilson sent a silver rattle as a peace offering. The Hayes silver mine continued to prosper, eventually becoming one of the most successful operations in the region. Henrietta and Forrest's partnership became legendary in Lano, a model of how a marriage could also be a true meeting of minds and abilities. They would go on to have 2 more daughters as strong-willed and intelligent as their mother. All 3 Hayes children grew up understanding the value of truth and the courage it sometimes took to stand for it. Lessons learned from parents who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances. And every year, on the anniversary of that fateful day on the courthouse steps, Forrest would present Henrietta with a single red rose and the framed newspaper headline that had announced their engagement. The judge ordered her committed. A cowboy proved her sanity and proposed on the courthouse steps. It served as a reminder of their beginning of darkness overcome, of truth prevailing, and of the love that had blossomed in the midst of adversity. A love that, like the silver in the Hayes mine, had proven more valuable and enduring than anyone could have predicted.